we're going to read through, we already read through this last week, and so we're not going to read through the entire 12 verses there. But verses 21 through 33 is the section of Scripture we're going to be focused on. And we saw last time in verses 21 through verse 25 what they saw. We may mention there how in verse 23, they brought down a branch of a cluster of grapes they carried between two men on a pole. They also brought back some pomegranates and figs. We also know that verse 22 mentions there the descendants of Anak who were there, referencing those who are many believe to be those who were giants. And so mentioning the people there in verse 22, and then some of the substance in verses 23 and 24 that they brought back. They returned from spying out the land after 40 days in verse 25. What is important to remember about the 40 days? What would happen to those who did not believe that they could overtake the land? Well, we know they were not pleased in the sight of God, and they were taken off into captivity. 40 days became what? 40 years, right? A year for every day that they were there. And you think about it, 40 days, you know, the area they're spying out, 40 days is a long time. I can't imagine trying to spy out a place in just a few days, but for 40 days, they're able to look and analyze everything that they saw and then come back and tell the people what they saw there in verses 21 through 25. Now, if you look here in verse 26 and through verse 29, you get into more of what they said concerning these things. In verses 26 through 29, well, it says here, now they departed and came back to Moses and Aaron and all the congregation of the children of Israel in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. They brought back word to them, to all the congregation, and showed them the fruit of the land. Then they told him and said, we went to the land where you sent us. It truly flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. Nevertheless, the people who dwell in the land are strong. The cities are fortified and very large. Moreover, we saw the descendants of Anak there. And so they kind of begin with what they believe to be the good. In verse 27, it truly flows with milk and honey. They're showing us some of the food and things they brought back. But then in verse 28, what would be maybe the bad, depending on your attitude towards this, they say, nevertheless, the people who dwell in the land are strong. Now, strong can be a reference to the number. It could be a reference to the idea of maybe men of experience in war or battle were there as well. But either way, they reference them as being strong. The cities are fortified, which means they could be difficult to overcome because of different fortifications they put in, maybe because of the walls, maybe because of how it was built and structured. It'd be easier for them to defend and harder for them to overcome. If an area is fortified, it's the idea that it is prepared to defend itself, is the idea there. And very large, verse 28. And so the people are strong, they say. The cities are fortified and very large. Moreover, this is kind of where we get into the idea of their attitude about it. They say, moreover, it's like someone saying, and on top of all that, the descendants of Anak were there, right? They saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites, verse 29, dwell in the land of the south. The Hittites, the Jebusites, and Amorites dwell in the mountains. And the Canaanites dwell by the sea and along the banks of the Jordan. This also helps us understand the areas in which they were spying out, right? And this is a large area. They mentioned the land of the south. They mentioned the mountains. They mentioned by the sea, along the banks of the Jordan. And so a large area in which they were spying out. And then they say here, as we'll see in a minute, we'll see what they feared in the next few verses. But this is their report, right? You have the good and the bad. But if you think about it for just a second, you look at verse 26 and 27, it seems, maybe not, but it seems, at least to me, they spend a little more time with the fearful side of things. One verse and a few words about what they brought back. Here's the fruit of it. By the way, here's all the stuff we'd have to overcome if we were to take that city, take this land there in verse 28 and 29. So they paint the picture for them there in those verses. It's flowing milk and honey, but it is well defended, very strong people live there, and on top of it all, the descendants of Anak live there as well in verse 28. Now, if you look at verse 30 through 33, you have at least the heading I have here is what they feared. The Bible says, and Caleb quieted the people before Moses. What does it mean, or why, think about this way, why would he have to quiet the people in verse 30? When do people start getting loud? When they get excited, right? It could be something good, it could be something bad. Now, based on his words, it would seem to indicate that they were excited for a reason of fear, right? He had to quiet the people before Moses and said, let us go up at once and take possession, for we are well able to overcome it. Now, these are the words of Caleb, right? Now, he says here that they are to go up at once, which means without delay, which would imply there's no reason for them to wait. There's no reason for them to say, hey, we need to think about how we're going to overcome them. Caleb understood, I think at least by his statement, you could say he understood quite well that God was with them, right? That he was going to be with them so long as they were faithful to him, that no one would stand before them, right? I believe it's Moses and Joshua, he would tell later as well, that as long as you live and as long as you're faithful, and I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, that as long as you live and as long as you're faithful, that no one will stand before you. Meaning that there's no army they could not overcome. Now, this being during the time period of Moses, this same would apply to him, obviously. And Caleb is quieting the people before Moses, so Moses is there listening and all the people. And what does Caleb say? Let us go up at once, without delay, without hesitation. Let's just go up and take it. And so Caleb has the attitude of, there's no reason to wait. Now, Caleb heard what they said, right? I mean, he heard them talk about them being strong in verse 28, about the cities being fortified. He heard about being large. Now, he was there, right? I mean, he saw all this too. He mentions, he hears them talk about the descendants of Anak. He hears them mention all the people who dwell in the mountains and by the sea and the land of the south, all that. He hears all that. But his response is, there's no reason to delay. Caleb was not one, based upon this reaction here, it would seem he's not one who's easily deterred, is he? Now you think about it for a second, and we know what's going to happen, right? We're familiar with this story. We know that there are going to be those who are naysayers, to put it mildly, who are going to speak after him. But Caleb heard all the potential negative news and negative report about the land, and it did not deter him. Now, what that would imply, would it take a great deal more for him to become worried? It would imply that at least it may take more, or maybe there would be nothing at all that would deter him. Because he knew who was with them, right? Who was with the people of Israel and with Moses so long as they were faithful? God. And anytime God is with the people and they have to have a battle or a war that they have to wage in driving out wicked people to take the land, when God is with them, they never lose, do they? They always conquer it, whatever the land may be. Now remember, they were promised to be able to overcome anything, and Caleb, I think, no doubt remembers that here in verse 30. When he says, let us go up at once, and he acts like it's just no big deal. Let's go up at once and take possession, which means he's kind of moves beyond the idea of taking possession, as if he almost gives no thought whatsoever of just beating them all, defeating them all. Let's go up at once and take possession, for we are. Now notice, he doesn't just say that we can do it. I think we can make it. There's no question there in his response. He says, for we are well able to overcome it. Which implies that he says it's not like we're going to have any difficulty. He's saying we are more than capable of defeating and taking this land that's been promised to them, right? God was going to give this to them. So they are to go up at once without any delay, take possession. Why? Because they are well able to overcome it. Now, think about this for a second. If God is on your side, does Caleb have the correct response? He has the correct attitude and the correct response, right? He knew who was fighting for them. He knew who was with them. And so, yes, he does have the correct response. He does have the correct attitude about it. There was no doubt. There was no sign of this was going to be a difficult battle, because he says here they are well able to overcome it. They're well able to take the land. Verse 31, but the men who had gone up with him, meaning he wasn't the only one, obviously. And now we find there are those who were not in agreement with what Caleb said. But the men who had gone up with him said, we are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we. What have they forgotten? What does fear do to people? Does fear make people illogical or forget certain truths that do not change? Has he forgotten, or have these people here in verse 31 forgotten that God is with them? By their words and by their actions, they seem to believe that. They kind of, oh yeah, wait a minute, God's with us, we can do this. They forget that. They say, we are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we. Now, if they knew that God, if they remembered that God had promised them to them and said this anyway, then that would imply they believed that God being with them wasn't enough. Either one would be horribly wrong, to forget that God was with you, or to believe that God wasn't enough. They say, for they are stronger than we. Well, that's not true, is it? That's not true at all. You remember when they came out of Egypt, who did God overcome on behalf of the people?
Pharaoh and the Egyptian army.
Pharaoh and the Egyptian army, an army that was not a small army, right? I mean, remember, this is the same army who had enslaved Israel, made them their bond servants for all those years. And so it takes a large army to do that, and a powerful king to do that. And God, after those plagues and showing his power over their foreign gods and their false gods, brings them out. And the last thing he does is he kills the Egyptian army and Pharaoh in the sea. And now these are some of the same people who are saying they are stronger than we. No, they're not. Fear will make you say things that are not accurate. Now, I've never been in battle. I hope I'll never have to be. But these individuals have already seen victory with God at their side. That's the point I'm making. They've already seen God have an incredible victory. Now, with each plague, in reality, God brought Pharaoh to his knees, and to the point he was going to say, let the people go, that he's going to let the people go. He never did. And then the next plague came, right? But each plague showed his power over Pharaoh each and every time, including all those false gods that those plagues corresponded with. But nonetheless, their fear, their forgetfulness, you might say, made them say they are stronger than we. And notice verse 32, and they gave the children of Israel a bad report of the land which they had spied out. Now, we know sometimes people will spin things a certain way, especially if they're afraid. They were afraid going up in battle, so what did they say? Well, it's not like what they said was wrong, but their spin on it was that they are stronger than we. They didn't say they're fortified. They're strong people who live there. The cities are large, but we can take it. They said there's strong people who live there. The cities are fortified, and they are stronger than we. That was their spin on it. Verse 32, the land through which we have gone as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants. And all the people whom we saw in it are men of great stature. Now, basically they're saying, it's interesting because to me it almost sounds like they kind of flip-flop. Well, relatively they do. Because they go from saying it's a land flowing with milk and honey and all these things, and they say what? The land through which we have gone as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants. Now, more than likely, they're talking about the other inhabitants who live there are cruel and they just fight against one another and kill people all the time. That's probably what they're talking about more. They could be trying to change and say, well, actually, it's too hard to live there. People die because the land's so hard. Either way, they're wrong because God can overcome any of those things. And neither of those things, if it's a reference to the food of the land, well, that's not true. They've already said that. But more likely here, it's a reference to the idea that those who live there are harsh people. The land which we have gone as spies is a land that devours its inhabitants. To be honest, one thing about that, I think about the city of Chicago right about now. A city that's filled with a lot of violence, a lot of death. And other cities that, well, we could put right alongside it. But so much violence, people were, I was read an article and saw some discussion about an article here, I think it was about 2 weeks ago, while in the streets, 70 shots were fired. No one was arrested because they said it was a mutual combatants, which means, what that term really means is, in reality, it's supposed to be it's fists, not guns. Basically, they said, well, it was mutual. They were both shooting, and so, people died. And that's kind of the thing about here, this harsh land where its inhabitants devour one another. Very, very scary place. That's the idea they put in the minds of Israel here. They're going to say, and all the people whom we saw in it are men of great stature. There could be men who are well known for battle. It could be men who are just big and strong. They've already said they're strong earlier, a few verses back, right? And so they're painting this picture as if it's a violent place. It could have been. And it's a place of strong people. Know that it was. But what Caleb says, Caleb was there. Remember that. He was there the whole time. But he saw the same things they saw. But his response is completely different than everyone else's. Now, not to get too far into this today, but if your response or your opinion is different from other people today, how well does that work out sometimes? People don't like it. Even though you speak the truth, what Caleb said wasn't wrong. He saw what they saw, but his response was, let's just go up now and take it. It's ours. That wasn't the response of the other men there in verse 31 and 32. And so no doubt they paint this very grim picture there. In verse 33, there we saw the giants, the descendants of Anak came from the giants, and we were like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we are in their sight. They're saying we're tiny people. These people are massive. They're strong. They're painting this picture as if there's no possible way that they could win. They could take that land. Do you remember one of the ways God described the land which they were to go and possess was described as a land flowing with milk and honey, right? That was God's own description of it. And if you back up and you look there at verse 27, what did they say? It truly flows with milk and honey, which tells us there's other things do as well, but tells us very clearly this is the land God was talking about. God had promised this to them. God never breaks a promise. And therefore, by logic, what Caleb says in verse 30 makes perfect sense. Let's go up and take it. He knew this is what God was talking about. He was there as well. He saw nothing that they could not overcome. That's why he says, for we are well able to overcome it. All these statements of fear there in verse 33, 31 through 33, it's just them being afraid to go up and do what God had told them they could do. Fear does, in reality, a lot of crazy things to people. It causes people to think in ways which maybe previously they wouldn't. You think about Caleb sitting there alone, basically alone, him and Moses, and of course, God being on his side, but everyone else saying there's no way. There's no way. Now you think for a second, how loud was their voice of doubt and negativity? How loud was it? Well, we can see it, can't we, in verse 30? He quieted the people. They were getting loud because they were getting afraid. And when he says what he does, the men decide, well, we haven't said enough. We need to really make sure people understand how impossible this is. So we're going to tell them a little bit more about it, give them a little bit more about their viewpoint, right? And they go on to talk about how they're stronger than them, how the land, in verse 32, he says that they give the children of Israel a bad report of the land, which they had spied out. They didn't just give a report, they gave a bad report. In reality, who should decide if the report is good or bad? the person who hears it, right? You convey the message. This is what we saw. This is what we observed. This is what was there. These are the kinds of people. This is what the city looked like. Now what do we do? And the first response before the men can speak up and say, we can't do it, is Caleb. The first response and the reaction to the report was Caleb saying, let's go do it. And we think about applying that today, and we think about what that means to us. When we have difficult tasks before us, it can be easy for us to say, well, we can't do that. We can't do certain things because they're stronger than we are. We're outnumbered. You know, I think about how many times, and I know I'm the only one who's heard things like this, people come in and commented about the number of things that this congregation does. Because we think about the works that we do or the works that we try to do, and the areas we try to be involved in, and you compare that, and we're not comparing it to brag, we compare that to other congregations you could be doing the same thing or more. It's a very telling sign, isn't it? Because we can't allow potential difficulties to deter us from doing what needs to be done. Caleb knew what had to be done. They had to go up and take possession. He acted in the way his words are there. It would seem to imply that all they have to do is just go up and start the fight, and that God would finish it, basically. If we start and we continue to do the things that we're doing in our area and trying to reach the lost in various ways we are doing it, and no doubt there are those around us who would say, well, you know, all kinds of negative things. It doesn't mean we have to listen to them and give in to those types of statements. And that's what Caleb was really encouraging people to do. They heard the report. They already heard about the giants before verse 30. But Caleb's reaction still is to go up and take it. But that wasn't enough, so other men began to speak up and speak a lot of negative words there. Any comments before we move on to our next section, which really continues with what we already looked at some here?
Russ, I think when you first read that, they were just given an honest report. You know, there in verses 27 through 29.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like the longer they thought about it, and people like that today, the longer they think about something, the more worried they get about it, the more concerned they get about it. And if you would just act and do it, you know, maybe your concerns would be allayed, or you don't even really want to know. You start what we call our house scenario chasing. Well, if this happens and this happens, like, they were being honest. Flows of milk and honey. The giants are there, and then the more people think about it, the more they have, well, the giants there. Well, if this happens and this happens, and this happens, they scenario chase. And Caleb's just like, let's just go do it.
Yeah.
And sometimes we just need people in the church and in the world let's just go do it. Let's get it done. Let's take action versus just sitting back. And you can plan all day and then do nothing, or you can do it and see what happens.
Yeah, and like you said,
we're being honest from a human standpoint, but there's a factor here that we have to put back in.
Mm-hmm.
Is we have to look through the eyes of faith.
Mm-hmm.
What has God promised?
Yeah.
And then act upon what God's promised, not based upon the honesty from a human standpoint.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and like Chris was saying, and it goes along with what you're saying, there were two reports given in reality. The simple report, and then kind of that wasn't enough, so we're going to add some more to it. And like you're saying, you know, we view things sometimes definitely with the idea of, well, we can't do it. Well, we may not be able to do something. We try to do it all of our own. But we know that when God is with us and having faith in him, that anything is possible. Now, we know this is prior to David's time, but we also know that giants can fall, can't they? I mean, David and Goliath. Again, this is before that, but David, when he went out to Goliath, do you think he had faith that God would deliver him? Yeah, because in reality, what do you go out there with? A sling and stone. Well,
Giants fall, Egypt fell.
Yeah, definitely.
And it was a giant.
Yes, with Pharaoh and all the things that he did. And so they had already seen, and we have today too, if we're honest, when we look at what God has done to the Bible, when it's promised us today. It's the same God. And so if he has done all these things, we can and should have that same faith that he's going to carry us through to the very end. Because like Chuck was saying, kingdoms fall, armies fall. Pharaoh and the Egyptian army being destroyed, not a small army. And we continue to go through that process. We find that God numerous times helps them overcome various giants and difficulties throughout the way, right? I mean, one of the difficulties they would have also after coming out of Egypt was surviving to get to this point, which God allowed them to do, right? The Bible tells us he clearly fed them, and to use kind of a livestock term, he fed and watered them the whole entire way to that point. And now here they are, they get to the promised land, and think about how you would feel if you had promised someone something. You get them all the way to that point, all they do is just take that final step, and they say, that's far enough. Because in reality, isn't that what they're doing? We believe you, and which they did at times back and forth, and they get to Canaan and they say, that's far enough. It's kind of like when Peter stepped out of the boat to walk to Christ in the water. He was already doing something that was supernatural. By the power of God, he had faith that Christ would allow him to come out on the water to him, right? But his fear was when he turned his head and he saw the storm coming. He forgot that he was already sitting on the water with Christ. And these people here have forgotten, at least partly, that they had already come out of Egypt, that had already been fed by God multiple times, the whole time coming out. He's already provided them in numerous ways. He's got them all up to this point, and now their reaction is, we're not going to go up. Now, if you read here, this leads us to the very next chapter. If you look here in chapter 14, where Israel, many Bibles say here, they get the heading, Israel refuses to enter Canaan. They refuse to go up and fight for it. God is capable of doing anything. God could decide not, you know what, okay, I'll kill them all for you. And they wake up the next morning, everybody's just dead. But he didn't. Does that tell us that even though God can save mankind, that mankind still has to act upon things? I mean, when they went up, when they refused to go up, they're saying that they're not willing to do their part. God has made this available to them, and Caleb seems to view it from the viewpoint of not just that we can overcome it, but the idea that we are able to overcome it, which paints a picture of this will be a tremendous, incredible victory. Let's just get up and go and take it, because that's what God has promised them. They would defeat any giant, so to speak, that would come their way, or any difficulty that came along their way. If you read through, and we're going to just read through it because our main text is following this, but if you read through verses 1 through about verse 10 here, you have where where Israel refuses to go up and to battle. The Bible says in verse 1 of chapter 14, so all the congregation lifted up their voices and cried, and the people wept that night. There's a few instances where we literally see cry babies in the Bible, and that's one of them. God told them already multiple times, you can overtake it, go up and take it. That was literally Caleb's words, almost verbatim. And what do they do? They give a bad report. In chapter 14 and verse 1, you find them just crying. And all the children of Israel, verse 2, complained against Moses and Aaron. And the whole congregation said to them, if only we had died in the land of Egypt, or if only we had died in the wilderness. What a horrible response. And I say that knowing full well that we ourselves, myself included sometimes, can act in the very same way. That we have things we could perfectly easily do and accomplish for ourselves, for the church, for our families, whatever it may be, and we say, I'm not going to do it. He says, there, verse 2, the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron. What happened the last time they complained against Moses? Someone's sister got leprosy, didn't they? Well, people also got what they wanted. They wanted meat, and what happened? People died afterwards because of their unthankfulness. I mean, bad things happen to complain against Moses, not because he is God, but because he is God's leader. They complain, and bad things happen. Well, here they are again complaining against Moses and Aaron. And the whole congregation, their words are, if only we had died in the land of Egypt, or if only we had died in this wilderness. Why has the Lord brought us to this land to fall by the sword? Verse 3, that our wives and children should become victims. Would it not be better for us to return to Egypt? Well, that kind of talks about what Chris is mentioning there in that scenario, right? What if we didn't just die? What if our children became victims? What if they became, maybe even servants, right? That scenario. No, we won't just die. What happened to our families? They'd have the victory too. It would be better. Would not be better for us to return to Egypt. What were they in Egypt? Servants or slaves, right? Keep in mind, if they returned to Egypt, the person they served the first time was dead anyway, right? So they wouldn't be serving him anyway. The army which was over them would be a different army because they were destroyed in the Red Sea, right? At least different soldiers. If the Egyptian army was to rebuild, it would have been the same people. That's the one I'm making. But verse 4, so they said to one another, let us select a leader and return to Egypt. Oh, bad idea. Let's pick someone else who's going to take us back. When I think about this is an old school way, Old Testament way of saying we're going to split the congregation. You stay here, we're going to go back. And we're going to see that God says, no, that doesn't work that way. Select a leader and return to Egypt. Then Moses and Aaron fell on their faces before the assembly of the congregation and of the children of Israel. But Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had spied out the land, tore their clothes, and they spoke to all the congregation of the children of Israel. So you find the response, verse 5, Moses and Aaron, they're going to pray to God. Now, the Bible doesn't reveal, at least not at this point, anything that they had said to God. Falling their faces before the assembly of the congregation of the children of Israel. This was a common posture when they were praying to God. I highly doubt they just knelt down and put their faces in the dirt and did nothing. But in verse 6, it mentions here Joshua and Caleb now, who were among them, they also tore their clothes. Now notice what they do. They speak to the congregation. They're warning them. The land we pass through to spy out is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord delights in us, which implies that we are faithful to him, right? Then he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land which flows with milk and honey, which they themselves have already said that was the case, right? Only do not rebel against the Lord, nor fear the people of the land, for they are our bread. Their protection has departed from them. The Lord is with us. Do not fear them. Now, there's a lot of ways you could describe certain victory. When you say they're our bread, he's saying we're going to just wipe them off. It's going to be as easy as eating bread. Their protection, he says, has departed from them, which means they are just waiting to be just destroyed. And all the congregation said to stone them with stones. Now the glory of the Lord appeared in the tabernacle meeting before all the children of Israel. Things just changed very drastically, right? So the people don't want to go up. They cry all night. Moses and Aaron pray to God. Joshua and Caleb speak and say, they are nothing before us. Let's go up and take the land. The people's response is, kill them. Because that's what you do when people disagree, right? You just don't. Well, that's what they thought. Verse 10, but what happens? The glory of the Lord appeared in the tabernacle of meeting before all the children of Israel, which means everyone saw the glory of the Lord appearing in the tabernacle of meeting. Now, in verse 11 and following, we find where the Lord, no doubt, responds. And he says, the Bible says here, then the Lord said to Moses, how long will these people reject me? That's a very true question to ask, right? Because that's what they're doing. How long will they reject me? How long will they not believe me with all the signs I have performed among them? When we think about this, the Lord's punishment was beyond just. I mean, they deserved what they were going to get. Because you think about what he says there, how long will these people reject me? Which means he has tolerated their rejection of him, and he has been trying to bring them to where they need to be for a long period of time, right? their rejection of him is stated like it's a continual action that he's trying to get them out of until finally he says, it's not changing, here's what's going to happen. Verse 11, and how long will they not believe me? Did they believe the words of God? No. They didn't believe they'd be fed. That's when they cried out for meat. Or they didn't believe they'd get what they wanted. That's when they cried out for meat. They cried out for water several times as well. Remember Moses reacting and being commanded by God to do certain things to bring them water. We find they also didn't believe that they could overtake, as we find here, the land of Canaan. And they didn't believe they could come out of Egypt. You think about that. I mean, they thought they would die along the way. They crossed over the dry land, across the sea there on dry land. The army pursues them, and the whole time they act as if they're about to die. They didn't really believe God all that often. And he still brought them out because that was his chosen people. And look at verse 12. And don't misunderstand to say that God tolerates sin, because he does. In verse 12 reminds us he doesn't do that. He says, I will strike them with a pestilence and disinherit them, and I will make of you a nation greater and mightier than they. What did God just say? He said, I'm going to strike them and disinherit them, and Moses, we'll start all over with you. That's basically what he's saying. That's how far they had come with their unfaithfulness, with their unbelief, as he mentions there in verse 11. And Moses said to the Lord, then the Egyptians will hear it, for by your might you brought these people up from among them, and they will tell it to the inhabitants of this land. They have heard you, Lord. They heard that you, Lord, are among these people, that you, Lord, are seen face to face, and your cloud stands above them. And you go before them in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. Now, if you kill these people as one man, the nations will have heard of your fame and will speak, saying, because the Lord was not able to bring this people to the land of which he swore to give them, therefore he killed them in the wilderness. What does Moses say? You're basically saying, if you do this now, everybody's going to say you killed them because you couldn't overcome the people of Canaan. Now, our God is a mighty and wise God. I have no doubt that he understood what Moses was trying to do. He was trying to save the people.
Don't you think that the statement that God said in verse 12 about building a nation from Moses has to be for Moses' evaluation? And the reason why I say that is because they're back in Genesis, 49, I believe it is, maybe 48. But he had promised Judah that the scepter would not depart from them.
Yeah.
And so a lawgiver would come out of Judah. Well, if he destroyed Israel, Judah would have been a part of it because Moses was of the tribe of Levi. So it has to be for Moses' evaluation. And Moses then, he lived up to what God expected and pleaded for the people and not to destroy the people. So Moses was a true mediator and a true intercessor and did what he was supposed to do.
Yeah. And it wasn't the first time he did that either.
No, by all means not.
Several times. And definitely, like you're saying there, a good point that he was their mediator and repeatedly their mediator. And the one who repeatedly, because of him being their mediator, spared a lot of lives. We saw that back in, I think it's Numbers 11 with the quail and things. I mean, multiple times. And no doubt doing it again here in Numbers as well. And so he is, again, like he has many times before, going to God on their behalf. And look at verse 17. And now I pray that let the power of my Lord be great, just as you have spoken, saying the Lord is long-suffering and abundant in mercy, forgiving iniquity and transgression. But he by no means clears the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation. Pardon the iniquity of this people, I pray, according to the greatness of your mercy, just as you have forgiven this people from Egypt, even until now. And so again, like Chuck mentioned, he is again going to God on their behalf. And he's asking God to forgive them. Now, again, like I mentioned before, he's not trying to have God overlook their transgression and not forgive it. The idea here is he mentions here, but he by no means clears the guilty, which means there's going to have to be a change somewhere, right? Well, what's going to happen is they're going to find punishment. We know what's going to happen as we continue through this. But he does not just forgive or just ignore the guilty and ignore the sinner, but he does provide forgiveness. And he does show mercy, as he mentions here again in verse 19. He says, according to the greatness of your mercy, just as you have forgiven this people from Egypt, even until now. Now, he mentions here in verse 20, and the Lord said, I have pardoned according to your word, but truly as I live, all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord. Because all these men have seen my glory, the signs which I did in Egypt and the wilderness, and have put me to the test now these 10 times, and have not heeded my voice. They certainly shall not see the land which I swore to their fathers, nor shall any of those who rejected me see it. My servant Caleb, because he has a different spirit in him, and has followed me fully, I'll bring the land where he went, and his descendants shall inherit it. And so we find here, let me back up a little bit. The Lord, he says he's going to pardon them according to the words of Moses, just like Moses said, asked him, the Lord's going to do that. But he says, truly as I live, all the earth should be filled with the glory of the Lord. And then begins to pronounce judgment on people, right? The guilty are not going to go into the promised land. He says, because all these men who have seen my glory and the signs which I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and have put me to the test now these 10 times. 10 times they've tested him. And let's be honest, testing God at all is not the thing to do. And they did so repeatedly by their actions, by their attitudes, by their words, by their inaction. Like we see here, they're not willing to go up. They're testing God. And he says they had not heeded his voice there in verse 22. Looking at verse 23, they certainly shall not see the land which I swore to their fathers, nor shall any of these who rejected me see it. These people are not going into the promised land. We know they're going to go to the wilderness to wander for 40 years. Caleb and Joshua were the only ones who get to see the promised land. But those individuals who did not believe will never, ever see that promised land. He says in verse 24, my servant Caleb, because he has a different spirit in him, it means he's a totally different person from all the other people who are saying we can't go up and take it. He has followed me fully, which means he didn't test God. He didn't reject God. He did not believe in God. He did all those things he should. I will bring into the land where he went, and his descendants shall inherit it. Okay, we're going to stop there because we're already past time. But if you continue reading Numbers, we know what's the going off into the wilderness, the punishment, and how those who were able to see the promised land afterwards, how their clothes and their shoes and things did not wear out while they're in the wilderness until they can come out and go to the promised land following those things. Okay, we're going to stop there this morning.